Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me today for our webinar on competition, data portability, and interoperability. Today, we'll be discussing policy implications of this technology area, and we're joined by experts and legislators on the topic. This webinar is part of an ongoing series hosted by BBC to address competition questions related to recent legislation introduced in the House around technology, antitrust, and competition in the economy. This is the first of many series today, and we will focus on interoperability and portability, as well as the Access Act. We are fortunate to have recorded remarks from Congresswoman Scallon, and who is the representative who introduced the Access Act. After a brief message from her, we'll have a discussion with 4 technology policy experts who represent perspectives, both pro and anti bill on the bill, and are experts in interoperability and portability. Quick reminder, you can submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook, or you can use Twitter using hashtag BBC Live. We will work towards making sure your question is addressed. And at the end of our session, we'll hold some time so that we can try to get it to as many questions as possible. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Congresswoman Scallon to hear her recorded remark. Just an introduction
everyone.
for Ms.
I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for hosting this important event, and thank all of you for attending this timely conversation about tech interoperability and data portability. I'm sorry that I can't join you for the live part of today's call, but I look forward to following this event closely and continuing to discuss how we all can make the digital marketplace a fairer place for everyone. As you're probably aware, the Antitrust Subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee undertook an historic multi-year investigation into the anti-competitive conduct attributed to some of the world's largest tech companies. Through this investigation, we discovered patterns of abuse by Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook that went well beyond the bounds of what can be considered fair or competitive behavior. Time and again, we spoke with individuals and small businesses who were harmed by this conduct, often with disastrous financial or personal consequences. It became apparent that for far too long, the dominance of the largest online platforms has stifled competition, compromised user privacy, and degraded the quality of services. By introducing bipartisan legislation to address the many problems we uncovered, the Antitrust Subcommittee has signaled that Congress is finally moving to address these issues head on. Now, I think it's important to note that this is the Antitrust Subcommittee of Judiciary. So our focus is narrowly on antitrust laws, as well as the legal ramifications. We did not delve as heavily into some of the tech aspects that some of our colleagues will be on energy and commerce. So first of all, with respect to portability and interoperability, in deciding how to allay the problems we found, the issue of biggest concern to me was addressing the inherent network effects of dominant firms such as Facebook and Google. Because in a big way, it's these network effects that have made it all but impossible for users to switch to competing platforms, even if they're unhappy with the service they're provided. For example, regardless of the quality of the platform, a user whose entire network is on Facebook can't simply switch to another social media platform that none of their friends or business contacts use. Conversely, a new social media platform will struggle to attract new users for the very same reason, trapping users on dominant platforms and freezing out potential competition. Now, while theoretically a consumer could simply leave a covered platform if they're unhappy, the services these firms provide are often too ingrained in everyday life for that to be a real option. In other words, these platforms have monopolized the conversation. Facebook and Google, for instance, often offer space for minority groups to organize and connect, for parents to get information about school closures or COVID-19 updates, and for small businesses to bring in customers. But the growing dominance of these firms in the digital marketplaces come with serious downsides. In a truly competitive landscape, we might expect that the best companies would rise to the top, but the strong network effects of the dominant platforms have perverted this expectation in the digital marketplace. We know this because many users are unhappy with the costs associated with using those platforms, often being forced to compromise their privacy, their data, or their ethics to participate online effectively. A mom or dad organizing a bake sale or soccer practice online might prefer to do so outside of Facebook to avoid exposing them or their children to misleading advertising. But doing this is near impossible because of a notable lack of real competition in social media and in the digital marketplace at large. Without meaningful competition, there's little incentive for firms like Facebook and Google to respond to user privacy and platform quality concerns, so they don't. And instead of a marketplace that responds to consumer demands, we get one that continually degrades user service and experience. So this is where interoperability and data portability can play a critical role. These tools offer us the chance to disrupt network effects and lower switching costs for consumers and businesses. It's with these tools in mind that I, along with my Republican colleague, Representative Burgess Owens of Utah, introduced the Access Act. So for the first time, this bill would establish data interoperability and portability requirements for dominant online firms, allowing new entrants to compete more effectively and giving platform users the ability to easily port their data to competing services. For example, much like texting allows iPhone owners to communicate with Android owners, so too would individuals switching to new platforms now be able to communicate and interact with their friends and family on Facebook. For startups and small businesses, this would be a game changer. Now, new and exciting platforms that focus on privacy and user satisfaction could proliferate and compete on their merits, no longer locked out by the unattainable costs of getting off the ground. Small businesses could capture and store important data, such as Google reviews or Amazon sales numbers, and take this information with them if they're unhappy with platform quality. Consumers would also find themselves emboldened and better served by the increased competition this legislation would yield. That parent organizing a bake sale, they could do so on a platform that works harder to prevent the spread of disinformation and still be able to invite their friends from Facebook. This bill also provides meaningful protections for user privacy, a priority for me and my colleagues on the committee. Businesses that choose to interoperate with covered platforms would have to meet the same security and privacy standards as the platforms themselves. And the FTC would oversee the creation of a new privacy standard to protect user data. Additionally, new authorities under the FTC would continually analyze the rules by which dominant firms interoperate with their competitors to ensure a safe exchange of information. No longer would those dominant companies be the only kids on the block. Instead, the firms would have to compete for users, and if they came up short, consumers would have more choices than ever waiting for them elsewhere. Now, the big tech lag generally. It's worth emphasizing that the Access Act is just one of a suite of bipartisan bills introduced as a result of the Antitrust Subcommittee's multi-year investigation. My colleagues on both sides of the aisle have put forward historic legislation to beat back the worst anti-competitive tactics employed by the dominant online platforms. Among many other changes, these bills would re-empower the FTC with funding and authority, lead to fairer platform practices for small businesses, and prevent dominant firms from abusing rival data to give them a competitive edge. Passing this package would be transformative for the digital marketplace and would go a long way to restoring a healthy, competitive online economy. So in closing, we know that big tech companies have convinced us that anti-competitive tactics and degradation in user privacy are just the cost of doing business. That to have access to great products, consumers just have to settle. But the Access Act and the other bills introduced by the Antitrust Subcommittee reject that premise. They say, let's do away with barriers to entry and anti-competitive behavior and allow online competition to flourish. If better platforms arise from the changes wrought by this legislation, then that's great. If Facebook or Google step up their service in response to additional competition, that's also great, because in the end, it's consumers and small businesses that will benefit from the additional choice. And that's really what these bills are about, the ability of Americans to have a real say in what works best for them and their families. So thank you all again for having me here today, and thank you for your interest in this topic. Again, I look forward to hearing more about today's discussion at a later date and to continue advancing this important work through the Antitrust Subcommittee. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scallon, for providing those remarks, and thank you to her staff for helping to coordinate the recording the submission of that video. With that, we'll turn it over to our panelists to discuss her remarks and also some of the finer points of the bill. So we'll just go in alphabetical order and start with Daniel Castro.
Hey, this is Daniel Castro with ITIF. And did you want me to weigh in yet, Tom, or just?
Just introductions for right now.
Great. So yeah, Daniel Castro with ITIF. Generally when I'm looking at this bill, my initial take is, data interoperability and data portability are good things. We want to encourage, but when you look deeper at how these requirements are being set forth in this proposal, I think there's a number of problems, and that's what I'm hoping we'll be able to talk about today.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Over to Samir.
Hi, I'm Samir Jain. I lead policy for the Center for Democracy and Technology. Been in the tech policy, tech law space for about 25 years, including in the Obama administration, where I was Senior Director for Cyber Policy on the National Security Council and Associate Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice. As we'll talk about, CDT in general thinks that interoperability and data portability are positive ways to increase competition in the digital marketplace. There's certainly some complex issues in terms of implementation, in terms of privacy and security that I'm sure we'll talk about today that need to be done right, I think, to avoid harm, but in general, supportive of the goals of this bill.
Thank you, Samir. And over to Matt.
Hey, everybody. My name is Matt Lira. I'm a partner at Hangar Capital. We're an investment fund that invests in early stage companies with a mission-driven focus. Prior to that, I was at the White House Office of American Innovation for the last 4 years, focused on tech policy and modernization of government services. And before that, was in a variety of roles on Capitol Hill and elsewhere. So excited about today's conversation. I think maybe my appetizer statement would be, the internet has been a remarkable force for good in the world. It's unlocked enormous value and connected a lot of people, but as it's matured in our society, we've continued to see challenges. And one of those challenges that I see is, preventing the internet from becoming dominated by a series of walled gardens and returning it to more of an open forum that it was in its golden age.
Thank you, Matt. And over to Sarah.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Sarah Oh, and I'm a senior fellow at the Technology Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. My areas of research as an economist and lawyer include telecom and tech policy and antitrust. Today my comments will focus on a few points and questions about oversight, the impact, how to measure whether such regulations are effective, privacy, how this particular bill interacts with federal privacy legislation, and also the question about SREMs and data transfers and how that would interact with interoperability and portability ideas.
Excellent. A lot to talk about today. So we'll go ahead and get started with a general interoperability and the standards involved. So I want to focus this first question over to Daniel. What data should be included in the standards? For example, any data about click-through rates or purchase products are arguably co-created by the user in the platform.
Yeah, so the question of what data to include in data portability is obviously one of the most important ones. The legislation that we're talking about does carve out proprietary data, which I think is important. So in theory, data that's owned kind of fully by a platform would not fall under this, but the lines aren't always really clear. So any kind of observable activity that a user engages on, any inferred data. If a platform is able to learn something about an individual or predict something about an individual based on their behavior, some of that data gets kind of commingled, and it's hard to tell what might be platform data versus user data. The other challenge that arises here is not only that kind of co-ownership that might arise, but if I upload a photo of a friend, or I tag a friend, or I like another user's comment, how much of that data is mine versus this other user. And the reason I think this question really matters is because how you want to define the data here probably differs depending on what goal you're trying to achieve. As I said earlier, I think generally data portability is a very good goal. Often the goal of data portability is that you can take your own data with you. So data that I have actually provided to a platform, I can take it back out of it. And I think that's a really important principle in general. And I think even startups often try to embrace that because the idea is, we want you to try our service and we want to make sure that, you can get your information back out of it. So for example, if you're using a new social network to share video clips, you might want to make sure you have access to those video clips, even if that service fails. It can help prevent data loss. But that's very different than if you're talking about really this concept of being able to, fully replicate, for example, the Facebook experience on another platform. You can't really achieve that just through data portability. And so, drawing the lines would look different if your goal is to, replicate the Facebook experience versus just make sure that, the photos you upload to Facebook, you have access to again. So I think, again, focusing on the data portability part, do you have access to information, content, data that you yourself have created and provided to the platform? That's what should be in scope. Everything else, we probably want to leave outside of it.
Very good point. So I want to direct this next question to Sarah. Who should have oversight of the standards?
Good question. I asked the same question myself. So in the Access Act from this round, from the House, it asks the FTC to create a technical committee that wouldn't actually have rulemaking authority, but the FTC would decide rules and standards. And so the question is, who oversees the FTC's decision on standards? And presumably it could go through the courts or Congress, but there's a huge question mark, and standard setting and development of FRAND terms in other arenas like electrical standards and other international standards take a long time to reach consensus. We know that in intellectual property law, standard setting is a big area of antitrust concern. And so this bill is asking the FTC to create a technical committee to create standards for data portability and interoperability, which is a huge task. And so I don't know who could be overseeing their decisions. And, I think the bill does say NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so it would kick it over to that agency, and then who would review their standards. So my concern is, in any standard setting environment, incumbents are more likely to capture the final decision, and that could exacerbate competition concerns, not mitigate them. And there is a data transfer project that was started in 2018, created by Google, and Facebook has joined it, Apple has joined it. So they're already creating an open source standard for sharing photos, contacts, calendar, playlists between themselves. So I'm curious to hear what I haven't read much about people looking at their decisions and whether that would help competition or not.
Interesting. So, just pulling on that thread a little bit, I want to ask Matt the same question coming out of government and at the White House.
Yeah, I think that is in many ways the question. It sounds like, generally speaking, there's fairly widespread agreement around the goals of this legislation and the broader effort. As has just been mentioned, even some of the big legacy players will speak to their support for these goals. Getting this right is critically important to ensuring that the bill, when implemented, will actually have the impact that is intended. And so I think about when both the Senate proposal from a couple of years ago, Senator Warren's proposal, and this current House proposal lean heavily on federal agencies. It's an area where I probably have a little bit of hesitation with the current language, not from the intention, but from the agility of those institutions and keeping pace with technical changes. And so I actually have no doubt in the professionalism and the ability of these agencies to come up with fairly robust standards, the first time around the track. Where my concern would be is when, as technology changes and evolves, their ability to rapidly make the changes that are necessary to the technical standards, so that the net effect of this proposal wouldn't be to capture legacy systems into the marketplace. Areas where I think personally, where we have seen this work well have been everything from how we provide certifications for electrical wiring to certain aspects, even from the healthcare community, believe it or not, where there have been sort of a hybrid arrangement with consensus making bodies who have developed standards that have been given the force of law through statute and through enforcement making bodies. An example of that is the fire standard in healthcare, which is developed by HL7, but has been given the force of law by HHS and the Congress. And so the current proposal, if you look at sort of a trajectory from the original proposals last year and I believe the year before, is trending in that direction. And it is my hope that a final proposal could actually get there where there's a little bit more of that hybrid representation. But that said, again, just to wrap, I think this is getting this right would be essential to making sure that the legislation is successful.
Yeah, so it sounds like the ability for federal agencies to come up with the standards is not in question. It's just a matter of keeping up with the technologies of tomorrow as they come out through the pipeline. Yeah,
I mean, I like to say, writing something in statute is writing it with cement. It is very difficult to change. And something can, you can make a sidewalk today and it is perfectly appropriate sidewalk, but then the world changes. And so when we're dealing with emerging technology, we want to make sure that there's enough agility in that process. And I think that there's ways to get there directionally with some of these current proposals. So I don't think that they're necessarily deal breakers, but it is an area where I'm hopeful the Congress will provide some serious thought.
I also, if I could just weigh in quickly, I also think my hope is that if the FTC does get assigned this responsibility, that it will also look to existing industry standard setting, multi-stakeholder standing setting bodies, the IETF, W3C. There are a host of other multi-stakeholder bodies that have a lot of experience in the development of standards around the internet. And I think, it would make a lot of sense, whether it's through the technical committee or otherwise, for the FTC to look to their expertise as well. Because I agree with what Sandra was saying earlier, that this is a really ambitious Sarah, was saying earlier that this is a really ambitious timeline that the current legislation sets up and is a real challenge. And so I think the FTC is going to have to draw on a wide-ranging expertise to meet it.
And a potential concern that I completely agree is that this would not be the first time. I think we have all seasoned enough to know there would be a congressional timeline that's not met by regulatory reality. But that delta is actually pretty dangerous to the objectives of the legislation in terms of its effect on the marketplace.
Very interesting. So I want to continue with Samir. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of the bill. Are there privacy implications for mandatory data privacy and interoperability?
Yeah, I think there are privacy implications. Obviously, there's when you're talking about data portability, you want to make sure that whatever data is being transferred from one platform to another is being done with the consent of the data owner. And this gets a little bit at the point that Daniel was making earlier in terms of the scope of the data, so that if I want to move my data from Facebook to a competing social network operator, to what extent can I take a picture provided that's on my timeline that was provided by a friend, or does that in fact violate that friend's privacy because the only thing they've done is given Facebook and me permission to view that data, to view that picture, and they haven't given permission for that picture to be shared with some other platform. So I do think there are privacy considerations, and likewise with interoperability in terms of what data exactly is needed to be shared between two platforms about users to make it interoperable, and what permissions are needed in order for that to happen. So, the legislation nods to this concern, and basically, I think to a large degree kicks it to the FTC to figure out the details of that. But definitely, there are privacy and security, I think, concerns at the end of the day that need to be dealt with here.
And Daniel, you've talked about this in the past. What are your same question? What are some of your concerns around privacy and around portability and interoperability?
Well, I think one of the questions is, if the goal is to export, just all of your data, that's one thing. But if the goal is to provide access to everything that you could see on the platform, that's very different. We only have to look back to, the entire Cambridge Analytica debacle was really about Facebook providing an API for third parties to get access to user data with their consent. And, so Facebook did this. Pretty much all regulators around the world have said that they didn't think they did that appropriately. And now we're talking about legislation that would force them to do that. And so, there's something, just something ironic about the fact that that's where we are 4 years later. And, there are, privacy implications, of course, of providing users with the ability to download things. There's also the reality that, if users do have access to this information through the Facebook interface, maybe there's not a privacy implication there, but we've had all the privacy regulators say that there is. So that's something that has to be balanced. But I think we also have to ask questions about, what happens when a bad actor gains access, because that will happen. I mean, we do know that, even if, it's designed where users are providing consent, and it's informed consent. I mean, we do have, phishing attacks. We do have, different types of, malicious actors lie and deceive users to gain access to their information. So that will happen. And then the question is, what responsibility do platforms have at that point when they are providing authorized access to a bad actor or a suspected bad actor or even a known bad actor? That raises serious questions about, where their liability will be, what they should be doing just as kind of good responsible stakeholders in this ecosystem, and what they even would be allowed to do under a law like this that tells them they must comply with these interoperability requirements or face potential significant fines. There's also issues around anonymity or pseudo-anonymity, where on one platform you might want to use one persona, on another platform you might want to use a different one. If you start requiring all this interoperability, there could be overlap between different identities that users might not be aware of or might not think about initially. So those types of questions should be addressed. I don't think are really contemplated in this legislation.
Another aspect of the privacy side is sort of who gets to take advantage of the interoperability. And in particular, I'm thinking, for example, of data brokers, that, if you end up in a situation where data brokers are able to take advantage of some of these rights and build further on profiles that they develop and then, sell to third parties or to governments and the like, that's a concern as well. And, I think the House bill tries to address this to some degree by putting limits on the extent to which recipients of the data can commercialize it. But that's another aspect of privacy, I think, that will need to be looked at closely by the FTC.
Very interesting. So I want to remind participants that you can submit questions at #PBC Live or in the YouTube channel. Again, we'll try to get those to those as much as possible. We talked a lot about the details of this privacy and data interoperability. Let's take a quick step back. So this question is for Sarah. Overall, what is the problem that this bill is trying to fix?
So presumably it's an antitrust competition concern that smaller companies aren't able to compete with the larger covered platforms. So that's a very good question. Is our goal to increase competition? And then the outcome would mean measuring, I guess, startup effectiveness, growth. And so if the bill is targeting covered platforms above a certain market cap, presumably that's Google, Facebook, maybe it would include Visa, JP Morgan, Walmart. A lot of other companies might fall into the category of covered platform. Then you would need to measure and see, are there competing services that are popping up? Is this legislation working? And I don't know if you would be able to measure that from after the fact. So that's a major concern of legislation like this. How do you know that it's increasing competition or making helping smaller companies create services? It would be very hard to measure. I mean, I would like to see a study that measures that. And so that would be that answer.
Interesting. So in order to fix it, you need to be able to measure it, essentially.
Yes, if this is really about competition, you would need to see, like, are there more startups in photo sharing or contacts or calendar as a result of such a regulation? I haven't seen any studies that really measure increased like vibrancy in an ecosystem in as a result of interoperability or portability regulations. So it would be nice to have some evidence-based policymaking in this arena before putting rules in legislation.
Very interesting. So let's kick it over to Samir. Same question. What is the bill trying to fix?
So, I mean, I think clearly it is trying to fix competitive concerns. I think the Congresswoman in her remarks alluded to the idea of network effects, that that one reason that someone may be reluctant to leave a Facebook, for example, for a competing social network platform, is that if all of their or most of their friends are on Facebook, and by leaving Facebook, they basically can't communicate with their friends any longer, that's a significant impediment to the competitor being able to attract customers. And so the basic idea, I think, is that with interoperability, if the person could leave, but nonetheless continue to communicate with their friends on Facebook, that facilitates the ability of the competitor to attract customers. I think I would note another sort of aspect of this that I think hasn't gotten a lot of attention because it was really a part of the Senate bill, not so much the House bill, although I think you may see it reappear when the Senate introduces this companion legislation, which is this idea of delegability, and the idea that in addition to sort of trying to create sort of competing social platforms to a Facebook or to a Google, that you're also creating interfaces so that you could have applications or software that ride on top of an existing platform and provide additional choices. So, for example, one idea that, and there's some examples of this out there, are that you have in effect a user agent that is able to which you can delegate privacy choices. And so you can tell that user agent, these are the kinds of privacy settings that I want to have generally, and that agent then can interface with your different services and make sure the settings sort of match your preferences. Or in the area of content moderation, the idea would be that even if Facebook does the moderation, you could have an app that you have designated, say a New York Times app that you trust to moderate the news feed that you're going to see from Facebook, and that therefore have a different kind of moderation experience or content experience even while you're using Facebook. But again, that requires a kind of an interface between that app and the social network. So I think that's potentially another way in which interoperability could increase user choice. I mean, there are a lot of complications there. I'm not saying this would happen overnight because it clearly wouldn't, but I think that's another vision here in terms of where interoperability could lead.
Very interesting. And I know we said that we were going to keep questions to the end, but this one has to do with the impact of the bill. So I'm going to ask it for the panel real quick. Hanandi Jordan asks, if the Access Act goes well, do you expect to see calls for data portability in other sectors of the US economy?
Yeah, I could weigh in on this one. I mean, I think there is value to, again, data portability in certain sectors. So for example, in healthcare, we have, the modification to the HIPAA with the HITECH Act, which gives everyone the right to access their personal health information at no cost. And, now getting this in electronic format, that's, kind of a form of data portability. We have, with in the financial sector, we have requirement that CFPB is considering on how to ensure that people have access to their financial data so that they can bring it into third-party applications. There are, I think, some very clear and narrow and defined uses for where data portability is good and helpful. And if this was a very narrowly tailored data portability bill, I think the discussion would look very different. I really think this interoperability requirement that starts raising a lot of questions because for example, banking, the types of transactions that you want to see are fairly straightforward. It's a withdrawal, a deposit, these types of things. It's one type of data, it's, financial information. When you're talking about social networks, you're just seeing, just tremendous innovation in the types of content, what that looks like, how it can be modified, collaborated with. The idea of interoperability there is, would significantly limit innovation and how you could build these types of platforms. You only have to look at the new types of social media platforms that are taking off right now, everything from TikTok, Nextdoor, Yik Yak. These are all addressing similar types of problems in new ways that if you were focusing on interoperability, you wouldn't be able to achieve that. I think also, if you look historically, if you go back, 20 years and think about other, dominant early internet platforms like AOL Instant Messenger or, IRC chats, where, you had the FTC or, congressional legislation saying we need to, require, data portability so you can download all your old chats and, require interoperability so, new companies can come in and do this. On the one hand, back then, that would have made as much sense as it does now. But, as we saw with innovation, even though these were dominant platforms, they gave way to new forms of communication. Even though, those were still basically text-based chats, we still do text-based chats, we just do them very differently. So, I'm just very hesitant to have Congress try and define ahead of time where we're going, especially in a kind of a vibrant area like the internet ecosystem, rather than in very narrow spaces.
So anything before we move on?
I think I would just like to emphasize, I think federal privacy legislation, the whole discussion around that, what kind of encapsulates the data portability and interoperability discussion. I don't know how, maybe you could narrowly tailor a bill to focus on interoperability and portability, but the more I look at it, I don't know how you would not, how it would be better to have federal privacy legislation that takes into account all the concerns over all different kinds of companies over data and GDPR, CCPA, SHREMS, because it's all interrelated. So I just think it seems impractical or just difficult to shape legislation in this arena in interoperability and portability without thinking about a larger federal privacy bill.
Very interesting. Yeah, the federal data privacy bill has been conversation for many years around DC. Speaking of, go ahead, Samir.
No, I was just going to say, we're strongly supportive of a federal privacy legislation. And while I think you'd want to make sure that any interoperability and data portability bill were compatible, didn't undercut the objectives of federal privacy legislation, I don't think that federal privacy legislation would achieve some of the competitive goals of data portability and interoperability. Now, you may disagree with those goals or think that this bill won't achieve those goals, which is obviously the discussion we're having. But I don't think privacy legislation itself is a substitute for what this bill is trying to achieve.
Thank you. So before we talk about too much in other statute and other potential bills to have, I want to focus in on this bill and see where the likelihood of it passing both the Senate and the House. And I'll kick it over to Matt. What do you think about that?
Yeah, obviously, it's always difficult to read the tea leaves on Congress, but I think that my sense of it is that we'll see more action on it this Congress than the previous Congress. I'm personally skeptical that it will get all the way to the president's signature in the context of this Congress, but I believe that we're going to see some serious progress on it this year and into next year. There are those who are more optimistic about it than I. That said, I would strongly encourage anyone, and I'm sure anyone who's watching this presentation is already there, to engage in this debate, because as we know, in the policy world, like things they move very slowly until they move very quickly. And so you want to make sure that the ideas that are on the shelf, the things that are working through the system, are correct and are sort of really refined. But I'm personally, so I think the debate is continuing to advance, and we see this time and time again with countless other areas of major policy change, where it takes one or two Congresses to become law. But I just don't see the political alignment around this, particularly in the Senate, to overcome the filibuster requirements to get this done this year. But who knows? I've been surprised before.
Sure enough. So moving to kind of the antitrust focus of this bill, several of the bills, including this one, use covered platform as a designation and apply regulations to those specifically. And I want to ask Sarah, can you explain what a covered platform is for our audience? And does it make sense to focus portability and interoperability standards on these covered platforms?
Sure, let me pull up the statute here. So a covered platform, I believe it's defined similarly from the Senate bill, the Hawley Warner Blumenthal bill from 2019. But the other panelists might correct me. This covered platform definition includes companies with at least 50 million US-based monthly active users. My question is why that number? Is there justification for that number? A covered platform would have at least 100,000 US-based monthly active business users. I don't know what a business user is. And the net annual sales or market cap would be greater than $600 million. And again, I don't know when that number would be determined. Is there a difference between net sales and market cap? Market capitalization depends on a PE ratio. And there is an adjustment for inflation by CPI. When would that happen? And I mean, presumably proponents of this bill would say the FTC would decide, but there's a lot of question marks in my mind. And then there's, and definitions for critical trading partner. So covered platform, covered platform operator is a person that directly or indirectly owns or controls a covered platform. So the definition of covered platform and also I was reading that there was a question if Microsoft fell into this category of covered platform. So in the House markup bill, there was some discussion that, it definitely includes Facebook, but it might not include Microsoft. And it just raises questions about this line drawing. Is it about the technology and the size, or is it about identifying particular companies? I have many questions about this creation of a list of who's covered or not.
Go ahead, Samir. You're right.
So I was just going to say, I think the House has been pretty clear that the four companies that are covered here are Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And I think there is a debate about Microsoft. And they've been pretty explicit about saying they designed the criteria with those four companies in mind, in part because the investigation that led to these bills really focused on those four companies. I think, the Senate I think it remains to be seen whether the Senate necessarily sticks with those exact definitions, or whether, over the different bills, it varies sort of the scope of what companies are covered. I think with respect to, I think there are questions about, whether or not that line makes sense as a policy matter, certainly in the context of data portability, for example. It may well make sense that users should be able to take their data from one platform to another, even if it's not one of those big four companies. I can see more justification for at least initially restricting the interoperability requirements to those four large companies, in part because I think the development of the required interfaces, the interoperability interfaces, is going to be really complicated, going to take a lot of resources. And frankly, I'm not sure in the tech industry there are other than those four companies who are initially going to have the expertise and the resources to develop those interfaces. And if you imposed that requirement on smaller companies, I'm not sure how they would do that. And so I think there's probably more sense in limiting the initial interoperability requirements to those 4 large companies. I think there's an argument to be made that data portability, there ought to be a more principled way of trying to draw that line.
I find it fascinating that it's admitted that this bill is targeting 4 particular companies. I don't know of any other, like, it just seems unconstitutional to me. Like, they might have just list the companies in the bill rather than coming up with a number. I don't know what you would say to that.
I mean, I think there is a constitutional provision called the Bill of Attainder that actually in general outlaws the naming of particular companies. I think their objective criteria right now, those 4 companies meet it. I mean, in theory, another company could grow and meet those criteria in the future. I think it's also possible that the Senate may end up creating some additional flexibility and allowing, for example, DOJ, which I think under the Access Act right now is the one that makes the determination whether or not a particular company meets these criteria, might give DOJ more flexibility to name additional companies as covered platforms as well over time. So, if in fact the competition works, you would see other companies presumably eventually end up as covered platforms here as well.
Very interesting. So in terms of the impact to the economy and business, I want to turn to Daniel. Does Section 230 play a role in this debate?
Yeah, so I mean, Section 230 is the question about whether online services are liable for the content posted by their users, and we've seen a lot of debate over Section 230, especially the threat from Congress of taking it away as a kind of incentive or motivation to get platforms to moderate content differently or to tell them to display content differently. And I can only expect that if this legislation moved forward, that similar efforts would be used. For requirements around data interoperability to kind of force or encourage platforms to moderate content a certain way. So you could, for example, think about a platform, and this really gets to these core content moderation questions, which is if you want to block, for example, a user, is that an interoperability problem? If you take this user off of your platform, then you're also taking it off of another platform, perhaps or perhaps not. If you're not, then that raises a lot of questions about how you can actually deplatform user and moderate content. If you are, that's an interoperability problem, and you're potentially subject to massive fines. And so I think this is something that really has to be thought a lot about. When we talk about deplatforming, and this whole conversation right now around deplatforming, that's often used as a way as how people are thinking about how do we address this problem of moderating content. But we really only talk about that in the context of platforms like Twitter and Facebook and these other social media platforms. We never talk about deplatforming someone from email or from making phone calls or sending text. And when you think about the problems that would arise from these interoperability requirements, one of those problems could be that you really could effectively no longer deplatform a user. If you take someone off of Facebook, Facebook takes them off, they can join another smaller network, and they can still send messages to Facebook users. As you heard, the representative talk about her legislation earlier, she specifically raised this point about, if you were organizing a bake sale and you didn't want to use Facebook, you could use this other platform. The vision of this legislation is that you could be on another platform and still send messages to Facebook users. So what does that mean for security? What does that mean for spam? What does that mean for if you think about right now, again, the biggest problem people have on their mobile phones is they don't answer them anymore because they're getting mostly spam calls and spam texts. That would be the shift that we'd be making to, on social networks. The other problem is, how do you actually ban specific types of content? If you have a platform, if you have Facebook, for example, that wants to take down a post, is that post still your data? Do you still get to use, have this data portability right to that information? Can you just port it to a new account and then repost it? That opens up a lot of avenues for being able to quickly, disseminate revenge porn, hate speech, terrorist content, and more. If you're able to quickly copy and re-upload it to other accounts. There's also the problem of bots, right? You have all these bots that are operating on these platforms. There's no exclusion that I saw in this legislation to say that bots don't also have a right to data portability and data interoperability. So how are we going to deal with those types of problems? So I think this really does open up a huge can of worms in terms of content moderation that, again, some of this might be, addressable if we thought through it. But I think you would more likely get to good answers if you had the platforms in charge of these APIs rather than how this bill envisions giving it over to competitors of these platforms to decide what these APIs would look like.
Samir, you've talked about this in the past. Any thoughts around 230 with this bill?
Sure. I mean, I agree that this doesn't affect 230 specifically. I mean, you can think of it the fact that 230 applies to all, interactive service providers, whereas as we've talked about, this bill would apply only to the four big ones right now. I also agree with Daniel that there are some complicated content moderation issues here. I actually think Congress should address that to some degree in this bill, in the sense of saying that a platform still should be free to apply its generally applicable content moderation rules to content, even if it originates from another platform. So for example, if Facebook has a policy of eliminating COVID misinformation and a user from another platform sends a message or post that would be posted on Facebook that contains COVID misinformation that would violate Facebook's policy, I think Facebook should in fact be able to apply its content moderation rule to that content and not post that content, that it should be able to control that, to be able to control its content moderation in that way. And I think actually Congress should say that more explicitly in the bills, to make clear that that kind of content moderation can continue to occur and that platforms can apply their generally applicable moderation rules.
Okay, I'm going to jump in because we're actually running low on time or short on time. Again, participants, please submit any questions you might have. We'll get to them in the last 5 minutes or so. I'm going to kick it over to Matt. You're currently a partner at a venture capital company. How will the venture capitalist industry or startups be affected by the potential changes to antitrust policy in the technology sector, specifically this particular?
Yeah, and in many ways, I feel like antitrust, and with the exception of the end users and the consumers themselves, the startup ecosystem is sort of a primary beneficiary or reason for any of these policies. The startup ecosystem that we have in the United States is truly exceptional. And it is one of our unique advantages globally and also just in the span of history, our ability to produce innovation and to improve the quality of life, unlock enormous economic value for millions of people, not just in our own country, but around the world. And that doesn't happen without the right regulatory and policy environment to enable it to happen. And so one of the things that I was going to chime in earlier, I suspected this may be coming, so I was going to wait, was that Sarah was discussing about these sort of quasi-arbitrary numbers for providing a gateway standard for the implication of new regulations. The reason why I agree with you that these specific figures may not be fully baked yet, but having the idea of having a gateway standard isn't as much about restricting it to the few, but protecting the many. Because you want to ensure, as Samir said, that the technical or the administrative requirements do not become gateway barriers to the development of new startups and more innovation in this space. There's no law of nature that says innovation has to occur. As recently, or at least it felt like recently, I don't know with the COVID world, but as many of you, you're in Europe and you look at these ruins and you see, like the Pantheon in Rome, and you're struck by the fact that it was sitting there for centuries and people had no idea how it was built in their own town. And so this idea that we live in a world where innovation is going forward and that each generation has more technology and a higher quality of life, in my view, is driven by startups. And that means we need an environment where they are free from administrative and technical burdens that make it impossible for them to succeed, compete, and scale. We see this in the financial services industry, where there are certain gateway numbers for financial institutions, and as they grow, they take on additional regulatory and judicial requirements. And I think that is, in principle, something that's in this legislation that I'm, again, directionally excited about, and that you see in a lot of the other proposals around Section 230 and other places. Dialing in where those gateways are, I think, is an entirely fair debate. But if there hasn't been, quite frankly, a lot of innovation in the social media space and in the app space in this area, because of the chilling effect of having a few dominant large market players. And so I believe that unlocking some of putting the consumer back in control and unlocking some of that will be enormously beneficial, not only to the marketplace, but to our country. But again, the regulations and laws are going to have to be designed with that in mind. There are no lobbyists for startups that do not exist yet. And so it's important that policymakers over-index thinking about how to protect those equities, because it's a voice that is otherwise unheard.
So we've hit the point where we want to try to get to some questions from the audience, and our next section was going to be about privacy and security risks as well as national security. So this question from Tom Schonenberger, and I apologize if I butchered your last name there, Tom, but could regulations over data portability, interoperability, and access to U.S. technical infrastructure leave user data and U.S. IP vulnerable to exploitation by foreign adversaries such as China?
I think that question.
Go ahead.
Okay. It raises a good example of TikTok. So TikTok is a competitor that has grown larger than Facebook now. I think it's, got more young users than maybe it's around Instagram size. And it's, I think, a majority owned by a Chinese company. So that's a great question for this kind of statute. Does interoperability, portability extend to a Chinese company? Like, are you going to include TikTok in this discussion? And, for competition concerns, does this act apply to US companies, and then you have a Chinese company taking market share? And so that doesn't even touch on data security and cybersecurity questions. So I'm curious to hear what the other panelists think about the TikTok example.
I mean, I think the bill as written would give TikTok the right to interoperability, at least depending on the scope of what services end up getting included under the standard. I think, this is just one reason why I think, it's important, and whether you're talking about a Chinese company or any other company or potential bad actor, that any standards really do deal seriously with the security question, because I think interoperability, sort of by design, you're connecting two networks and allowing data and other material to be sent from one platform to another. And there's always the chance that that data includes malware or something else malicious. And so there have to be rules and the ability of the receiving platform to block that data if necessary, or to otherwise put protections in place for security reasons. And I think that's true for any, as I said, I don't know that that's limited to foreign actors. I mean, you can have malicious actors of any kind against which you have to protect.
I think to Sarah's point, if China was the one passing a law right now saying US companies had to let Chinese companies have access to their data, we would be up in arms. If the European Union was doing this, saying that they wanted access because they want European companies to compete, we would have questions about that. And so, just because it's not China or the EU creating this law doesn't mean we shouldn't consider the competitive effects it will have on the US industry.
Yeah, and I think it's an area where there's probably a balance that can be struck. Clearly, there's an equity there. I mean, in the spirit of the Bipartisan Policy Center, President Biden signed, a pretty good EO a couple of weeks ago on cybersecurity. I think I'm allowed to say that. So the cybersecurity equities are coming to the forefront, and I think need to be weighed in. And I'm sure. I can't speak for them, formally or informally, right? But I feel like the bill's authors would say that they envision the agencies taking those equities into account. My personal view is that Congress shouldn't outsource that discussion. They should bring that into the legislative process before they enact that into law, and not just create a technical committee at FTC or NIST and just say, oh, they'll deal with that problem. It's an important enough problem that it needs to be architected into the bill.
So I'm going to jump in here and thank our panelists for their time today. This has been a very insightful question, and I appreciate very much everybody providing their perspectives and expertise. I also want to thank the participants who are listening in virtually. Thank you for joining us today. We have many more webinars coming around the corner here, and thank you for your questions. Again, stay tuned for other webinars, and thank you for Congressman Scallon for providing her remarks as well. But that will do it for us today at BBC, and thank you so much for listening in.
Thanks.